Of all the issues plaguing modern society, perhaps the most divisive argument is what we should do about guns. The gun control argument has been raging for decades, and over time, two distinct and highly vocal groups have emerged. On the far right of the political spectrum are so-called gun nuts, who are often caricatured as rednecks who would love nothing more than an excuse to shoot someone. The far left is often represented by the gun grabbers, who are often visualized as greedy politicians and celebrities who want to take everyone's guns. While there may be a few individuals who fall into either of these two camps, the vast majority of the American population lies somewhere in the middle. Every American is capable of having a reasonable discussion about guns and gun safety in the right setting. The Second Amendment is a very important piece of American legislation, but so is the National Firearms Act. I think that reasonable regulation is not only compatible with the Second Amendment, but is necessary for the preservation of a safe society. Our country usually doesn't talk about guns until someone uses one to commit a mass murder, and in recent years, mass murders such as school shootings have become startlingly frequent in America. It is true that most gun owners would never hurt another human, but it is also true that disturbed individuals are able to cause more damage with a gun than, say, a knife. Guns are inherently dangerous, and every firearms safety course will emphasize this. However, to suggest that firearms are the cause of murders is misguided. Our society does not place the blame for a bombing or stabbing on the weapon, but on the individual who committed the act. I think we should treat gun crime the same way. Unfortunately, the debate has become so polarized that many people lose sight of these facts and tend to argue based on emotion instead. One thing that must be made abundantly clear about guns is that they are neither good or evil, but are simply inanimate objects. Since guns are so deeply ingrained in American culture, I don't think it's possible to ever get rid of them entirely. To even attempt such a task would be a logistical nightmare, since many guns are not registered or traced by the government. However, I don't think every American should own a gun. The Second Amendment does guarantee an individual's right to keep and bear arms, but as with every other law, there are exceptions. A common comparison is to the First Amendment. While it protects our right to say nearly anything, it does not give individuals the right to scream "fire" in a crowded movie theater. In much the same way, the Second Amendment is subject to reasonable regulation in the interest of public safety. A bioethics professor writing for the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal described the problem thusly. Given our assumption that there is a right to gun ownership, it would be improper to ban guns in the name of enforcing the various rights that may be violated in the household due to improper gun use. By the same token, the latter rights would not be duly respected if we interpreted gun rights so capaciously as to preclude gun control measures that are reasonably related to household safety. A major concern regarding gun ownership is the mental state of the owner. Millions of gun owners across the world are normal people, but there are a few who are objectively unfit to own a weapon of any sort. There are abusive men and women out there who are aggressive enough to pose a threat to their spouses and children, as well as anyone else around them. Ideally, these people wouldn't be able to own firearms, but it will still happen. There are steps that can be taken to reduce this risk, however. For example, Oregon passed a law in February 2018 that closed a legal loophole by which abusive partners or ex-partners could still own a gun. Another issue that needs to be resolved is the ever-present problem of making sure each transaction involving a firearm is legal. For years, politicians have talked about the gun show loophole, by which people can buy guns without going through the usual background check process. In my research, I could not prove the existence of this loophole one way or the other, but I did learn that Great Britain has a similar problem. Many politicians with anti-gun perspectives point to Britain as a perfect example of what America's gun laws should be. Perhaps not without reason. Great Britain hardly ever sees guns used in crimes, but it does have a continuing issue with disturbed individuals getting their hands on these weapons. In the wake of a 2012 triple murder committed by a man with a gun, it was found that police returned his confiscated guns with a stiff warning following a series of domestic incidents. Perhaps the most prevalent concern in American culture is that our country simply isn't adequately educated about firearms. Anyone who has spent time at a shooting range can tell you how many people are completely unaware of safety concerns, such as waving around a loaded gun, accidentally pointing it at people, keeping their finger on the trigger, and forgetting to engage the safety. These are all very dangerous problems with a simple and cheap solution: education. We teach young children not to approach a gun if they find one, and this is the right thing to tell a younger child. But as children in America mature, they are surrounded by violent media of every form, and most of this media stylizes or softens the impact of gun violence and promotes unsafe behavior. It is my belief that if firearm education was included at a middle or high school grade level, most likely as a part of a health class, accidents involving guns would decrease. American students should be made aware of the damage a firearm can cause, and how to stay safe if they are operating one. As people become gun owners, their education about firearms should continue. While this measure may sound extreme, I believe it is in the best interests of public safety for all new gun owners to pass an NRA certification course before they can complete their purchase. This would be a trial period in which the potential owner must prove they are physically and mentally capable of handling a firearm. This should include a psychological evaluation designed to separate mentally stable people from those with higher levels of aggression or depression. It would ensure that guns stay out of the wrong hands, while remaining respectful of the rights outlined in the Second Amendment. Of course, the Second Amendment should not be seen as the end-all be-all of political discourse on guns. It is not a guarantee that every American be allowed machine guns, nor is it outdated and in need of repealment. It is a living, adaptable piece of legislation, just like every other amendment, and should reflect the times we are living in. In the 1700s, firearms technology was much more limited, and cultural problems like gangs were not nearly as prevalent. But as our country grew, so did the meaning of the Second Amendment and the ways it can be regulated. As a professor of law at the University of Tennessee stated, "It is not too much of a stretch to say that what we know with confidence is only that, under current Supreme Court doctrine, the government may not categorically ban handgun possession in private homes, or require that all firearms in a private home be kept in an inoperable state. Almost everything beyond these propositions is, doctrinally speaking, up for grabs." Where the American public is divided is how to regulate guns. A common talking point is the issue of background checks. All legal transactions are already subject to background checks. Contrary to popular belief, you cannot just walk into a sporting goods store and come out with an assault rifle, shotgun, and ammunition. You will have to undergo a background check and waiting period before getting any firearm. There are a host of other laws regarding the legal age to buy certain types of guns, which guns you can and can't buy without government permission, and the types of attachments you can legally put on a gun. Proponents of gun control often point to Great Britain and Australia as examples of how a widespread ban on firearms can reduce crimes committed with them. This is true to a certain extent. However, tragedies do still occur in each country. In fact, Australia recently witnessed its largest mass shooting since enacting its gun buyback program in 1996. Buyback programs such as those found in Australia or Great Britain have been the subject of much debate in the United States. By their very nature, these programs are designed to disarm a law-abiding population. Many proponents of the programs argue that this is for the best. The British journal Nursing Standard published an article in 2013 claiming that the solution to mass shootings is simple. First, you develop the laws and conventions that make keeping guns socially unacceptable. Then you empower the police to enforce the law, building public confidence and reassuring people that there is no need for personal gun protection anyway. By most accounts, this method has worked relatively well for Great Britain, and the country rarely sees any mass shootings, although other forms of deadly assault, such as acid attacks, have increased in recent years. There is still debate on how much the bans influenced this, though. A Washington Post article from October 2017 says, "Neither nation experienced drops in mass shootings or other gun-related crime that could be attributed to their buybacks and bans. Mass shootings were too rare in Australia for their absence after the buyback program to be clear evidence of progress. And in both Australia and Britain, the gun restrictions had an ambiguous effect on other gun-related crimes or deaths." There is also a very large cultural difference between Americans and the rest of the world. The simple fact is that Americans are extremely attached to their guns for a variety of reasons. For some, owning a weapon means exercising their constitutional and natural right to self-defense. For others, having a gun might be necessary for survival or safety. Many appreciate firearms for their role in American history, and still more simply enjoy the experience of shooting. It is my firm belief that a gun control program as strict as that enacted in other developed countries would not work in America. For better or worse, our culture and history are so attached to firearms that any effort to remove these guns from their owners would be met with resistance on a national scale. While a full-scale gun buyback program would most likely fail in America, politicians have considered enacting a far-reaching ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines. This is a misguided maneuver, because assault rifles are not responsible for the vast majority of gun violence in America. That title belongs to handguns. Moreover, focusing on assault rifles as the prime example of military-grade firepower that citizens can own is fallacious because it completely discounts every other type of firearm. The military does not use civilian-style assault rifles, but it does use the same shotguns, pistols, and long-range rifles that nearly any citizen can buy. To suggest that assault-style weapons are inherently more dangerous than any of these other weapons is to downplay the damage any firearm is capable of inflicting. The movement to ban assault rifles is little more than political posturing, designed to vilify one specific type of weapon, and plays more to the public's fear than to reason. The biggest problem with regulating firearms is that only law-abiding citizens will ever be affected. No matter how strict or serious a law is, there will always be someone who breaks it. In this case, criminals will always find a way to procure a firearm if they want to. A major concern of those who oppose gun control is that if private citizens aren't allowed to own firearms, only the criminals and government will be armed. Ultimately, the argument over gun control has become much larger than it ever should have been. One side seems determined to hang onto its guns until their last breath, while the other seems equally determined to rid America of guns completely. The answer, of course, lies somewhere in the middle. Our country needs to find a way to reconcile both our Second Amendment rights and the fact that guns are still subject to regulation. We need to shift the focus of the argument from guns to the people who wield them. This is why I think the best solution is to implement a system that ensures the responsibility of each gun owner. In the same way Americans are required to pass both a written and practical test before receiving their driver's license, they should be required to complete both a written and live fire test before being able to purchase a firearm. As described earlier, this test would include a physical and psychological evaluation of each individual, designed to ensure that only responsible adults are able to own a deadly weapon. A solution to America's gun problem is nearly impossible to find. There is an overwhelming amount of information to consider. Racial and economic tensions, politically motivated violence, gangs, die-hard patriotism, mental illness, and dozens of other factors that could lead someone to shoot another person. But I believe that we must first step across the political aisle and find what we can agree on. The Second Amendment clearly states that individuals have a right to defend themselves with a firearm, but remains open to legislation that would narrow the number of people allowed to exercise that right. Before our society can move beyond emotionally charged political warfare, we need to accept that guns and gun control are both essential for keeping Americans safe.